Hello, everyone. My name is Yoav Waxman, and I'm professor of economics at Coastal Carolina University. This is lesson one for Econ 202, Microeconomics, and we're going to talk about supply and demand, the two driving forces in any market. At the bottom left, we see a picture of a realtor working with our clients. The real estate market is one of the most interesting markets to study because it takes a long time to sell and buy houses, and this market sometimes moves slowly. At the bottom right, we see a woman buying vegetables and fruits. These are perishable goods, and these markets tend to adjust rather quickly. So in this video, we're going to explore the fundamentals of supply and demand. We're going to explain how prices and quantities are determined in competitive market. Essentially, when demand or supply changes, it affects both the market price and quantity. We will also examine the laws of demand and supply and what causes a shift in each curve. The law of demand says that when price goes up, quantity demanded decreases. This is a pretty intuitive law because as things become more expensive, people tend to buy less of them. The law of supply is a bit harder to understand. It shows that when price goes up, the quantity supply increases. And the reason for it is that there is more incentive for suppliers to sell a product if they can sell for a higher price. We will also review market equilibrium, talk about shortages and surpluses, and discuss government intervention such as price ceilings and price floor. Generally, we don't want the government to intervene in the market since it's going to create distortions. But there are exceptions, which we'll also discuss. At the bottom left, you see a picture of the stock market, one of the most active markets in the world. Things happen very quickly in the stock market, and buyers and sellers are constantly selling and buying asset, sometimes doing both of those things in the same day. And at the bottom right, we have an example of a shortage, a situation where there aren't enough product to meet consumers' demand. And that could happen, for example, during a pandemic or before a hurricane, when there's what we call panic buying, and people run to the supermarket to get basic necessities like bread, toilet paper, and water. Let's begin with the law of demand. The law of demand states that the price increases, quantity demanded will decrease. In other words, they are inversely related. This is pretty intuitive. Imagine, for example, movie tickets. When movie tickets become more expensive, fewer people are going to go to the movies. This is called an inverse relationship or a negative relationship. But it's important to explore the two different reasons why this happens. The first one is called a substitution effect. When certain products become more expensive, some consumers are going to switch to similar substitute. So at the bottom right, we have a picture with different types of meats. And you can imagine that if beef became more expensive, some people might switch to pork. Or if chicken became more expensive, some consumers may buy turkey instead. This again is called the substitution effect. But there's a second effect called the income effect. As prices become higher, it reduces consumers' purchasing power, causing them to buy less. So if we go back to the example of the movie theater, if you just have a limited budget for going out, if you find out that movie tickets are more expensive, you may decide to stay home instead. This relationship is illustrated by a downward sloping demand curve that we see on the bottom left. So as you can see, when the prices are high, the quantity demand is relatively low. If we look at P1, it has a low corresponding Q1. As the price decreases to P2, we see the quantity demand increases to Q2. And when the price is relatively low, such as P3, we see a high quantity demanded. This graph illustrates the negative or inverse relationship between supply and demand. So what things will shift the demand curve? Demand can increase or decrease with change in taste, population, or income. If you think about taste and preferences, our taste and preferences are constantly changing. This is due to cultural trends, research, and marketing. In the past, it was very common for people to smoke cigarette, but now people are well aware that they're extremely harmful. In addition to that, the government is taxing cigarettes very heavily, and all those things have caused a decrease in the demand for cigarettes. Similarly, as the population increases in places like Myrtle Beach, where Coastal Carolina is located, we see an increased demand for things like groceries, real estate, and other product. Income is a little bit trickier. Most goods are normal, which means that if our income increases, we're going to buy more of them. You could think of most goods like groceries, vehicles, or entertainment. As your income increase, you're likely to buy more of those things. But some goods are inferior goods. And those include things like processed food that we see at the bottom left. As our income increases, we're likely to switch to better substitutes. So if your income goes up, you may stop buying microwavable food and canned food and switch to fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh meat. Similarly, as your income goes up, you may stop using public transportation and buy a vehicle instead. Finally, expectation of future prices can shift demand today. This is typically only true for goods that are expensive and durable. For instance, houses. If we expect the price of houses to go up in the future, we may rush to buy a house today so we can avoid the higher price. Or if it's August and we expect the price of cars to drop in October and November when the new models come out, which is typically the case, we may wait for a few months to buy a car, even though we need one now. The price and availability of related good also influence demand. There are two types of related good. The first type we already talked about. Those are substitutes, goods that are similar in characteristics. For instance, if you like Cheerios and the prices of Cheerios increases, you may choose another cereal like Special K. Complements are things that go together, things that we typically consume at the same time. So going back to the example of cereal, if the price of milk increases, people will buy less milk. But it also means that they're less likely to buy cereal because most people buy cereal and milk at the same time and consume them together. So let's look at a couple more examples. A rise in the price of Coca-Cola can raise demand for Pepsi. At the bottom right, we see a demand curve. We have price on the Y or the vertical axis and quantity per time, meaning quantity per day or quantity per month on the X or horizontal axis. The demand curve, as noted before, is downward sloping. For high prices, we have relatively low demand. And for lower prices, we have relatively high quantity demanded. But when the price of Coca-Cola increases, more people are going to demand Pepsi instead. That's going to cause a whole rightward shift in demand for Pepsi. An increase in demand is a shift to the right, whereas a decrease in demand is a shift to the left. Similarly, a higher movie tickets can produce popcorn sales. So if a movie theater decides to increase the price for movie tickets, fewer people are going to show up at the movies, and even those who show up at the movies are less likely to buy snacks because their budget is more constrained. So an increase in the price of movie tickets will cause a leftward shift in the demand curve. When we talk about demand, it's also important to talk about elasticity. Elasticity measures the responsiveness of quantity to price. Elastic goods are goods that we typically don't need and often have multiple substitutes that are similar. When the price of elastic good changes, we see a big change in quantity. For example, if the price of airline ticket to the Bahamas increases, it's likely that some people choose to go somewhere else because there are many substitutes to the Bahamas. They might go to Aruba instead or Key Largo. Additionally, there's an income effect. So if you're planning a vacation to the Bahamas and you realize the tickets price are more expensive, then you may wait till next year where the prices drop or you have more income available. Goods that have a high elasticity have a relatively horizontal demand curve, which is shown at the bottom left. Here we see that when the price increased from 10, from 50 to 60 pounds, we see a big decrease in quantity from 100 to 50. So again, elastic means that a small change in price can cause a large change in quantity. By contrast, inelastic goods are goods that we really need and typically do not have close substitute. Here, we might see a large change in price causing a small change in quantity. So at the bottom right, we have a graph of an inelastic good, and here we see price go up from P1 to P2, but this caused also just a small change in quantity from Q1 to Q2. Understanding elasticity helps businesses set optimal prices. For instance, retail prices are more elastic than basic groceries. So hotels have to be very mindful about even small price increase because it may drive consumers away and can greatly benefit by reducing the price and having a sale. We're going to talk more about elasticity in the next lesson. Let's look at the law of supply. The law of supply states that as price increases, quantity supplied will also increase. Inversely, if price decreases, quantity supplied will decrease. That means that price and quantity supplied are moving in the same direction. They are therefore directly related, also known as a positive correlation. This law is a little hard to understand than the law of demand, but think about from the perspective of the producer. Suppose you have a bakery, as you can see at the bottom left, and you have a choice between selling bagels, breads, croissant, or other baked good. If the popularity of croissant increases and you can make more money for them because their price is going up, you're likely to focus on producing more croissants. A price is a signal of desirability. When there's more desirability for a product, its price will typically increase. That's a signal for suppliers to produce and supply more. Therefore, the supply curve is upward sloping, as we can see at the bottom right. It means that as price increases, we see the quantity increase as well. Once again, we see price on the vertical or the y-axis, quantity per time on the horizontal or x-axis. And here you can look at an example of 2 points. When the price of croissant is $1, the quantity supply is relatively small. When the price of croissant goes up to $5 because the desirability goes up, we see the quantity supplied increases. This results in an upward shape supply curve. There are also things that shift the supply curve. These are known as supply shifters. Supply changes when production costs, technology, or the number of sellers change. For instance, think about production costs. If producers have to pay more for electricity, raw material, or labor, they're going to reduce supply because they cannot afford to supply as much. So, going back to example of a bakery, suppose that the cost of flour and eggs became more expensive. You won't be able to produce as a baker quite as many croissants and loaves of breads. You have to cut down your supply. Similarly, if you had to pay your workers a higher wage, you may decide to stay open for fewer hours because you cannot afford to pay your workers for a long shift. Therefore, a rise in production costs will reduce supply or shift it to the left. At the bottom left, we see the cost of framing lumber. And during the COVID-19 pandemic back in 2020, we saw a jump in the price of lumber. That was the national hump in a circle. And again, the same thing happened in 2021 as we had shortage in logistic. And once more in 2022, which was a combination of logistical problem, the inability to bring enough lumber to the United States, and also a rising demand for lumber overall as due to a construction boom. So this rising prices of lumber constrains developers and reduces supply of homes. Technology also improves production, making it more efficient to produce and therefore increasing supply. On the bottom right, we see an example of a car factory. Car factories, like many manufacturers, are becoming increasingly mechanized. This enables suppliers like Toyota or Ford to produce cars faster and therefore increase their supply of cars. And finally, the number of sellers. This one is pretty intuitive. If there are more people selling milk, more dairy producers, then we expect the supply of milk to increase. If there are fewer people selling milks, fewer dairy producers, we expect the supply to decrease. As with demand, expectation about the future can affect current supply. This is only true for goods that are durable and are expensive. So if you think of the example of houses again, if developers expect the price of houses to increase, they might buy land right now and start building houses so they can benefit from the higher prices. As another example of supply, a drought reduces coffee crop, shifting supply to the left and raising coffee prices. So if we go back to the supply curve on the bottom right, when the supply increases, it shifts to the right, much like demand. And when supply decreases, it shifts to the left. Now we can think about supply and demand together and how they interact in the market. On the graph at the bottom, you have demand, which is downward sloping, and supply, which is upward sloping. The point where supply and demand intersect is called the equilibrium. It is the point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. If we are above that equilibrium, for example, prices are set high, we're going to see suppliers want to supply a lot of the product, but consumers don't want to buy a lot of it. For instance, imagine if the price of milk was $10 per bottle. Of course, supermarket would stock up on milk, hoping that it can sell it for a high price, but consumers would not buy a lot of it. This will create a surplus or excess supply of milk and force supermarket to quickly reduce their price. On the other hand, imagine a market where milk only costs $1 per bottle. Now, supermarkets don't have the incentive to stock up on milk, and there won't be much milk for sale. On the other hand, consumers want to buy a lot of milk at this new low price. This will create a shortage, a condition in which consumers show up at the supermarket and do not find enough milk. Many consumers don't find any milk, and this would lead suppliers like Walmart and Kroger to raise the price of milk and start stocking up on milk again. These adjustments are called self-correcting mechanism. The market communicates through surpluses and shortages. A shortage, a shortage is an indication to suppliers that they need to increase the price and get more of the product, whereas a surplus is an indication for suppliers that then must reduce the price in order to sell the excess inventory. This is particularly true for perishable goods like fruits, vegetable, and meat that will go bad unless they're sold. On the other hand, the housing market adjusts very slowly because, uh, for one thing, sometimes suppliers, which are sellers, have a mortgage on their property and are unable to sell their house at a lower price because then they'll owe money on the sale. So durable goods adjust slowly, where perishable goods adjust quickly. Let's think about surpluses and shortages more deeply. Surpluses occur when the prices are too high. This is known as excess supply. Shortages occur when the price is too low. This is known as excess demand. Producers lower prices to eliminate surpluses and raise them to reduce shortages. So at the bottom left, we have a picture of a bin full of vegetables. That occurs when supermarkets don't sell enough vegetables and fruits. That's why sometimes you go to the supermarket and we see a reduced price on things like cucumbers or bananas. It's a signal that the suppliers must sell them before they perish. On the other hand, at the bottom right, we see an example of a shortage. This is a picture from the 1970s where there was a large shortage of gasoline. In 1974 and again in 1979, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, got together and decided to penalize the United States for supporting Israel by cutting down the supply of oil to the U.S. This created a large shortage for gasoline at gas station, and you can see all the cars lining up looking for gasoline. Many of these drivers will see an empty pump once they get to the gas station. The government could intervene by creating price ceilings and price floors. Price ceilings and price floors are two examples of price control when the government tries to influence prices in the market. A price ceiling sets a legal maximum price for a product. A common example of this are rent control and fuel price limits. For instance, during a hurricane, the government may try to intervene by putting a price limit on essential goods like toilet paper and also construction goods like lumber. While these price ceilings seem to help people in need, they actually create distortion in the market. So at the bottom right, we see a picture of demand, which is again downward sloping, and supply, which is upward sloping, and the government forced a price ceiling. It's important to note that if the price ceiling is above the market equilibrium, it doesn't have any effect on the market because the market could still reach the equilibrium. However, if the price ceiling is below the market equilibrium, as we see in this graph, the quantity demanded would exceed the quantity supply and would be a shortage in the market. So let's go back to the example of the government creating a price ceiling for lumber after a hurricane. This is done in order to try to help consumers and try to prevent what we think of as price gouging. Suppliers charging a very high price to take advantage of a short-term situation or crisis. While this may seem helpful, it creates a shortage in the market, and a lot of consumers will not be able to find lumber. More importantly, as we noted earlier, a higher price is a signal to suppliers that they need to produce more. And the prices in, let's say, Florida rose following a hurricane, it will cause suppliers from around the United States to bring more product to Florida, like lumber, quickly resolving the crisis. So by creating a price control, price ceiling, the government is essentially making the crisis worse. Another example of this is rent control in cities like New York. They limit the rent that landlords can charge. This has several effects. For starters, if landlords cannot get a high enough price for their property, fewer people rent their property. But also, with rent control, as we see at the bottom left, landlords have the incentive to neglect their property. It doesn't make any sense to maintain a property if you cannot get enough money by renting it. So rent control creates shortages and create neglect, causing conditions of neighborhoods with dilapidated homes and oftentimes high crime rates. What about price floors? A price floor sets a legal minimum on the price. In other words, a price support. As we can see from the bottom right graph, a price floor is ineffective if it's below the equilibrium price because the market can still clear, meaning reach equilibrium. However, if a price floor is set above the equilibrium price, we're going to end up with a surplus. With these high prices, producers want to produce a lot, but consumer would not want to buy a lot of the product. So there'll be a lot of excess of this product. An example of a price floor are minimum wages. Minimum wages force employers to pay a certain amount. While they may seem to help people, a minimum wage means that, or could mean that some people will not be hiring workers because they're too expensive, especially small businesses that have a limited budget. And they could potentially create more unemployment. Similarly, the government supports farmers through the agricultural marketing service. This agricultural marketing service creates price floors for things like corn and soy. That means that there's too much corn in the United States, a surplus of corn, and too much soy. The government then buys these surpluses and stores them in large facility like we want to see on the bottom left. Both price floors and price ceilings distort the market, and generally, economists do not favor price control by the government for that reason. So to summarize what we learned today, supply and demand determine the prices and quantity in competitive markets. Elasticity shows how sensitive buyers and sellers are to price changes. Necessary products tend to be inelastic, while products we don't need that have many substitutes tend to have an elastic demand. Markets tend to move towards equilibrium. If the price is too high, we're going to see usually a surplus in the market, and that's a signal to producers to reduce their price to get rid of excess inventory. If the price is too low, we're going to see shortages in the market, and that's going to incentivize producers to raise prices and raise their inventory. And government policies like price floors and price ceilings create artificial shortages and surpluses and generally distort the market and prevent consumers from benefiting from competition. So just for your thought, what do you think about which product have a high income effect and why? Remember, a product have a high income effect if they are necessary, like gasoline, and have few available substitute. Should the government have price support to help poor families? If not, what's a better solution? So if a local government wants to create affordable housing for poor families, should they institute a price ceiling or rent control? And if not, what else can the government do? And finally, if a product creates harmful pollution, for example, paper, which is used a lot of chemical, should the government regulate or allow the market to solve this problem, and why? So with that, we have concluded lesson number 1. My name again is Yoav Waxman, and I wish you a wonderful day, and I'll see you in future lessons. Have a great day.